Creepy cabin stories that will make you question your safety story. 1. The Echoes of Black Pines. Cabin located deep in the forest near the town of Black Pines, the cabin was a hidden gem, a place where people would rent out for a weekend getaway. Surrounded by trees and miles from the nearest neighbor, it was the perfect place to disconnect. But when the Anderson family arrived at the cabin in the fall of 1998, they found something far from peaceful waiting for them. The first few days were idyllic. The kids played by the nearby stream, the parents enjoyed the quiet, and the sun-dappled forest was a picture-perfect retreat. But on the third night, they started hearing strange sounds. At first, it was faint tapping at the windows, then footsteps on the porch. The couple assumed it was animals, but as the noises grew more frequent, they became worried. By midnight, the sounds had turned into full-on banging on the door, followed by guttural whispers that seemed to come from the woods. When the father, John, looked out the window, he saw nothing but the darkness of the forest stretching endlessly. The next morning, the family packed up and left the cabin early, terrified by the feeling of being watched. But the worst part was when they returned to town and learned from a local storekeeper that they weren't the first to experience the strange noises. The cabin, it seemed, was built over land where, years ago, a family had mysteriously vanished. Local legends spoke of a forest spirit that lured people into the woods, never to be seen again. The Andersons never went back. Story 2. The shadow in the cabin. Samantha and her friends decided to rent a cabin in the Appalachian Mountains for a weekend hiking trip in the fall of 2015. The cabin was rustic, beautiful, and surrounded by dense trees with no other houses in sight. It was perfect for a weekend away from the noise of city life. But after the first night, Samantha started to feel uneasy. Around midnight, she woke up to the sound of something moving outside her window. When she glanced out, she saw a figure, tall, dark, and humanoid, standing near the edge of the forest. She thought it was one of her friends, but when she called out, the figure didn't respond and it didn't move. As she reached for her phone to call her friends, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving across the cabin's porch. Terrified, she rushed to wake her friends, but when they searched the area outside the cabin, they found nothing. As the night went on, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the woods, watching them. The next morning, they noticed strange markings on the cabin door, scratches that looked like claw marks. The group decided to leave that morning and never returned. Years later, they learned that the cabin had once been owned by a family who had reported seeing a dark figure in the woods before they mysteriously disappeared. Story 3. The cabin that wouldn't let go. The summer of 2007, a couple, Lisa and Tom, rented a secluded cabin for a relaxing weekend in the mountains of Colorado. From the moment they arrived, they noticed something strange about the cabin. It was old and run down, yet it felt strangely alive. The floors creaked, the windows rattled in the wind, and the air felt dense. By the second night, things took a bizarre turn. Lisa woke up to find Tom gone from their bed. She searched the cabin, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as she checked the locks on all the windows and doors. Everything was secure. She found Tom sitting in the corner of the living room, staring blankly at the wall. He seemed completely disoriented. When Lisa asked him what had happened, Tom couldn't remember anything. He was convinced he had been asleep the entire time. They decided to leave, but as they packed their things, they noticed the front door wouldn't open. They struggled with the lock, but it refused to budge. It was as if the cabin itself didn't want them to leave. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open on its own. When they returned to town, they spoke to a local about the cabin and learned it had once belonged to a man who had died alone in the very room they had stayed in. You see, cabin was rumored to trap people who stayed there, keeping them from leaving. Lisa and Tom never spoke about the experience again, but the unsettling memory of the cabin's grip on them stayed with them for years. Story 4. The forgotten cabin in the woods. Anna and her husband David were looking for a quiet, romantic weekend away and decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods of Maine. The cabin was secluded, with no electricity and only a small generator for power. It was everything they wanted: isolated, peaceful, and quiet. But soon after they arrived, strange things began to happen. On the first night, Anna heard whispers in the walls. She dismissed it as the sound of wind or animals outside, but the whispers grew louder as the night progressed. David couldn't hear anything, and Anna assumed she was just being paranoid. However, the next evening, Anna woke up to find the cabin cold and dark. Her flashlight wouldn't turn on, and the generator was off, even though it had been running, when they went to bed. The next morning, David went outside to check the generator, but when he returned, he was pale and visibly shaken. He told Anna that he had found an old, half-rotted notebook buried behind the cabin, with pages filled with scribbled notes. The last entry read, "It watches. Don't go inside after dark. It will take you." Terrified, the couple decided to leave, but when they tried to drive away, the car wouldn't start. After hours of trying to fix it, they realized something even worse. The cabin wasn't visible from the road anymore. It had completely disappeared, leaving them stranded in the woods with no idea where they were. Only after days of wandering did they manage to find the main road. They never spoke of that weekend again, and they vowed never to return to those woods. Story 5. The old cabin in the snowstorm. Tommy and his friends decided to take a winter hiking trip in the Rocky Mountains. After a day of snowshoeing, they stumbled across an old abandoned cabin and decided to spend the night. They were ill-prepared for the weather, and as the snowstorm intensified, the cabin seemed like a perfect refuge. The cabin was old and furnished with dusty, faded chairs and a broken stove. It was clear no one had been there for years. But after a few hours of settling in, the group began to hear strange noises, scratching at the windows, the sound of muffled voices, and the floorboards creaking as though someone was walking around upstairs. Tommy went to investigate but found nothing. When he returned downstairs, he found that the group had moved to the other side of the room, closer to the fire. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences escalated. The door began to rattle violently, as if someone was trying to get in. But when they opened it, the snowstorm outside seemed still, and there was no one there. The group realized that the noises coming from upstairs weren't the wind, but the sound of footsteps moving around above them. The next morning, they found strange symbols carved into the cabin walls, symbols that resembled old occult runes. The group left in a hurry, and when they made it back to town, they learned that the cabin had been the site of a tragic event decades ago. A family had died in the storm while trapped inside. Their bodies never recovered. Story 6. The Man in Nye. The window on a camping trip in the mountains of Tennessee, Ben and his girlfriend Amanda rented a small cabin for the weekend. The cabin was remote, surrounded by trees and located miles from the nearest neighbor. It was perfect for stargazing, hiking, and just getting away from the world. But after the first night, they began to feel uneasy. Around midnight, Amanda woke up to the sound of a door creaking. When she looked up, she saw a shadow standing in the window. The silhouette of a man was clearly visible, his face obscured by the darkness. Amanda froze, unsure whether it was her mind playing tricks on her. But when she nudged Ben, he saw it too. They tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a camper walking by, or someone lost in the woods. But as they checked the cabin's windows and doors, they found them all locked from the inside. The figure never moved. He simply stood there, staring through the window, unmoving and silent. Terrified, they packed their things and fled the cabin in the middle of the night. But when they reached the nearest town, they learned that the cabin had a dark history. A man had once lived there alone and had mysteriously vanished one winter, leaving only his footprints in the snow leading to the cabin. Story 7. The Haunted Cabin of Old Hollow Creek Inn. 1994, a group of friends from college decided to rent a cabin on the outskirts of a small town near Old Hollow Creek. The cabin had been vacant for years, but its remote location and low price made it the perfect weekend getaway. Little did they know the land surrounding the cabin was steeped in tragedy. On the second night of their stay, They heard strange noises coming from the attic, scratching, scuttling, and faint whispers. When they went up to check, they found nothing. But over the next few days, things grew stranger. Items in the cabin moved on their own, and the group began to see strange figures darting between the trees outside. At night, they would hear faint whispers, calling their names, urging them to come into the woods. One evening, they decided to investigate the creek nearby, hoping to shake off the eerie feeling in the air. That's when they stumbled upon a graveyard hidden in the overgrowth, marking the final resting place of the original owners of the land. The gravestones were old, weathered, and cracked. But there was one grave in particular, a small marker with only a single word etched on it: help! The group fled the area that night, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. They never returned to Old Hollow Creek. Story 8. The Cabin. Under the Mountain Inn. The early 2000s, a young couple, Derek and Claire, decided to rent a cabin near the foothills of a mountain range for a weekend getaway. The cabin, secluded deep in the woods, was perfect for hiking and escaping the busy city life. But there was something about the cabin that seemed off. On their second night, as they sat by the fire, Claire heard something tapping at the window. When she looked outside, there was nothing but the darkness of the woods. Later that night, they both heard it, a faint knocking coming from beneath the floorboards. They checked the cabin thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone or anything under the floor. By morning, Claire found strange, ancient symbols carved into the wooden beams. They decided to leave, but as they walked out, they saw a figure standing, in the distance, tall, cloaked, and watching them from the shadows. Claire screamed, but when they looked again, the figure had vanished. Story 9. The Whispering Cabin Inn. 2010, a group of college students rented a remote cabin near the cliffs of Lake Michigan for their summer break. It was an old, weathered place, complete with squeaky floors and creaky doors. The first night was uneventful, but by the second night, strange things began happening. At first, they heard whispers from behind the walls, hushed voices that seemed to speak their names. When they checked the walls, there was nothing there. But as they tried to sleep, the whispers grew louder, filling the room. One of the students, Julia, finally decided to investigate, opening the door to the dark hallway. That's when the whispers stopped. But there, at the end of the hallway, was a figure, dark and shadowy, standing motionless. When Julia screamed, the figure faded into the darkness, and the house went eerily quiet. The group decided to leave the next morning, but as they packed, they saw strange markings appear on the walls. Names, faces, and symbols, all written in what appeared to be blood. They left and never returned, but some say the whispers still haunt that cabin by the lake. These 9 creepy cabin stories show that some places, no matter how beautiful or remote, carry dark secrets and restless spirits. The eerie noises, shadowy figures, and unsettling events will leave you questioning your safety and wondering whether it's better to leave well enough alone.